To you, a man I've respected for a very long time, Mr. Michael Matt. He is the editor of the Remnant newspaper, which is a very influential and very good traditionalist Catholic newspaper in the United States. Going to be advertising the great stuff that's going on in Japan. He was at Mass this morning showing all the great stuff that traditionalists are doing. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to Michael Matt, and he's going to be speaking about the War of the Vendee. Please help me welcome Michael Matt.
Thank you very much. Is that okay right there? Like that? Reverend Fathers, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters in Christ, it's just such an honor for me to be here. Hope everybody can hear me back there. I share Dr. Morgan's position on the United States. Patriotic as can be. Thank God for my country. Patriotism is a natural virtue. We must be patriotic. But as an American, I'm embarrassed by the propaganda campaign against the monarchy, the Catholic monarchy in France. As a little child growing up, we all heard the horror stories of Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, who was a beautiful 15-year-old Austrian girl who was, in a sense, dragged away from her mother and her father and brought to Paris, where she had to play the part of the Queen of France. And she did the very best that she could. And not only did the revolutionaries in France, but the revolutionaries in America tried to destroy her reputation and destroy the reputation of her husband, King Louis XVI. So the whole expression, "let them eat cake," she never said that. Benjamin Franklin, a Freemason in my country, invented that in order to create bad press and to help sell the revolution in France, the bloody revolution in France, which had already been experimented in the United States in a less bloody Revolutionary War in 1776.
マリー・アントワネットの話は私は非常に悪いことを昔は聞かされました。しかし真実といえばオーストラリアの方で王家の方で、そしてフランスの王女として非常に。
So many years ago, I traveled to France for the first time, 30 years ago, and discovered the true French. And the true French are Catholic to the core. They are our brothers in the faith. They proclaim the kingship of Christ proudly, and they are a minority. They are a remnant. So I would say what I have the great honor today, in this week that I've been visiting your country in Japan, I'm finding the same thing, that we are brothers. We are brothers and sisters in Christ, even though our culture is very different. I see the Catholic Japanese as my brothers and sisters, and I'm so very honored to be here with you today. In my country, we are increasingly rejecting Christ. We are increasingly rejecting the Catholic Church. We're using the clerical sex scandal as a weapon. We're weaponizing that against the Church, trying to make it appear as though all priests are sexual predators, when that is certainly not the truth. But that's what they are now doing. So the good news is that in coming here, I published a newspaper, as I said, the Remnant newspaper in America. And as this neo-paganism and anti-Catholicism covers the earth, everywhere I go, I'm so happy and gratified to see the emergence of a growing remnant of believers, like people in this room who are beginning to see through the revolution. They're beginning to see how hollow the revolution is, how false it is, and how it can be overcome by us becoming truly Catholic once again. So I traveled 6,000 miles to stand here today for the sole purpose of coming here to be with you and to make a pilgrimage to Our Lady of Akita, to the shrine. Traveled 6,000 miles to be with you because you're faithful members of the Christian remnant, just as we are in the United States, a small remnant who still believe and who understand what is at stake, not only for us, but for the whole world that rejects Christ, that rejects his kingship, his law, and his very existence. We are all here today, in other words, because we know what task lies before us, the task of survival, the task of keeping the old faith, the task of outliving the revolution without compromise, which began with Lucifer's Non Serviam, which was institutionalized by Martin Luther's defiance of Christ's vicar and declared war on Christ himself, this revolution, in France 230 years ago, when our Catholic forefathers in France, especially in the Vendée, first declared war on the New World Order in its nascent stage. Today we all live in a post-Christian world, a world in which the very idea of Christ and Christianity is being systematically wiped from the face of the earth. A world in which the church, in her human element even, has declared war on her own traditions. A world in which persecution of all things truly Catholic is now imminent, no matter where we live. But persecution is not the end. Persecution offers proof that the revolution has failed, that a remnant has survived, that God in His providence will see to it that the cross will rise again from the ashes of the New World Order which we now face, just as it rose from the ashes of the old order of pagan Rome 2,000 years ago. The Vendeans are the forefathers, the Vendeans. They are the forefathers of the modern traditional Catholic movement because their uprising was just the first campaign against the anti-Catholic Enlightenment, which sought to elevate reason and individualism and man over tradition and the church and God. Its theologians, such as Descartes and John Locke, commissioned new missionaries, such as Voltaire and Rousseau, to go out into Christendom and undo what the Jesuits had done, what the Franciscans had done, and what the Dominicans had done. Where the Catholic missionaries brought the Mass, the old faith, and the light of Christ into pagan darkness, these new missionaries of the Enlightenment sought to destroy that Mass, to destroy the old faith, and to extinguish the Lumen Christi from the face of the earth. They brought on the Dark Age, not the Catholics. They brought on the Dark Age, a real Dark Age. They promoted a brotherhood of man that would use the sword and the cannon to enforce the iron will of one tyrannical regime after another. And the war they started in the Vendée in France 230 years ago is still raging today. It's the same war in which every traditional Catholic in the world today finds himself engaged. In fact, we are the sons, the descendants of the royal and Catholic army of the Vendée. And our war, now and then, is not just liturgical. It is not a battle for the restoration of the traditional Latin Mass, as important as that is. It is not merely a battle for the restoration of the Mass. And armed with rosaries, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and the old Latin Mass, this peasant army in the Vendée stood against the very same devils against which we stand today. These French Catholics lost their lives, but they kept the faith, and they handed it down to the next generation and on to the next, just as the hidden Japanese Catholics did the same when they stood with Christ, even as their world turned against Christ. The Christian century here in Japan from 1550 to 1650 is remembered even in America. And what is it remembered for? It is remembered for persecution and perseverance. For the 26 martyrs crucified at Nagasaki in 1597. For Catholics who survived 250 years without priests, without sacraments, and without the Mass. For keeping the faith through one of history's most brutal persecutions here in Japan, and handed that faith down to the Catholics who have gathered in this room today. As Japanese Catholics, you know this story far better than I, but I am inspired by your history, and I will talk about it briefly, that some 300,000 Japanese converts here in Japan by 1580, a mere 30 years after St. Francis Xavier had arrived in the land of the rising sun. But then in 1600, when Tokugawa shogunate and the leaders of the Shinto and Buddhism initiated a brutal persecution of Christians, they boasted that the missionaries, the Catholic missionaries had failed, that Catholicism had never really taken root in Japan, but they were wrong. They forgot about the remnant. They forgot about the strength of the faith, the remnant of Catholics in Japan so devoted to Christ that when missionaries returned to your country in 1850, 250 years later, they were shocked and amazed to discover the Kakure, the hidden Catholics, who had kept the faith alive in Japan for a quarter of a millennium without the Mass, without priests, and under intense persecution.
日本において信仰を絶えず
And this shows the power of faith, the power of Christ, because the Japanese lesson is the same lesson that we learned from France. Much later, in the Vendée, the forefathers of the traditional Catholic movement. And so I'm going to ask you for a moment to put yourselves back in time to the bogs and the marshes and the lowlands of Western France, to the place where Saint Louis de Montfort, St. Louis de Montfort, has planted the seeds of faith so deeply in France that even the infernal columns of hell, which would come later from Paris, could not destroy that faith because of the faith of the simple people in France. This is a story about regular people. It's not a story about saints at the time. It's not a story about people who considered themselves exceptional. The people in Western France were just like us, just normal Catholics trying to live their lives. And when suddenly something terrible happened in their capital city up in Paris, now this is the eldest daughter of the church, France was being led to the guillotine. Priests and king, nuns and queen lost their heads. Ambassadors and representatives of Christ the King being murdered and slaughtered at the very heart of Christendom. The entire Christian social order was being systematically executed in Paris.
キリスト教の中心で組織的に処刑されていったのです。
But in the south and in the southwest of Paris, there was a group of Catholics left who would not be bullied by the revolution, who understood what was at stake just as we understand what's at stake now. This was the remnant that in the face of that demonic revolution, and that is not an exaggeration, it was truly demonic, the demonic revolution, fought and died for the right and the honor to say these words, Voilà ma gloire, mon espérance, et mon soutien, mon chant d'amour, et de victoire, je suis chrétien. Je suis chrétien. That is what they fought and died for, the simple, I am a Christian, and I will not change. This is what's being asked of us today, to deny that we are Christians, to set it aside, to become a secularist cooperator with the devil. They refuse to do that, and so must we today.
しかしこの悪魔的な本当にこの意味
In your country, these Catholics are known as the hidden Catholics. In France, they're known now as the Vendeans. They were called les chouans because of their battle cry, which actually imitated the sound of a screech owl in the woods. They screamed like screech owls as they raced onto battlefields in which they were hopelessly outnumbered. Pour la foi, pour le roi, for the faith, for the king, is what they fought. Like us, they too had been denied their priests, their Catholic way of life, their Mass, their sacraments, and they were hunted down like animals. They too had to take to the forests. They had to hold their Masses in secret, their marriages in secret, all of their sacraments in secret. They waged guerrilla warfare in desperation against ruthless oppressors, les Bleus, the Republican-trained regular army troops, their own countrymen, who were ordered then to wipe them out because they had become apostates. Their own countrymen had become apostates and become the mortal enemies of the Chouans, of the Vendeans. So as we proceed, let's remember, we're talking French against French. The only difference was the French on this side abandoned Christ. The French in the Vendée held him up and defended him.
日本では隠れキリシタンと言ってし
The name of their army was the Royal and Catholic Army of the Vendée, but it was made up almost completely of peasants, with some nobles that were more or less pulled into action to lead them because they had the military expertise. But for the most part, it was peasants. It was fathers and sons. It was tradesmen who who were defending their priests, the last remnant of Catholic France. Their weapons were crude, literally pounding plowshares into swords, very crude weapons, whatever they had at hand. And they fought in a ferocious defense of hearth and home, mass and priest, altar and throne, true patriotism, love of country, yes, but love of God, love of the priesthood, love of the mass is what motivated these people. And they were so impressive. It's not just us Catholics looking back 230 years. Even Napoleon Bonaparte was an admiration, outright admiration of the Vendeans. He refused a commission to fight against the Vendeans because he didn't believe in the cause of exterminating the Vendee. And he called the war in the Vendée le combat des géants, the war of the giants, the little giants. He noted that the Vendeans, had they not gone home after every successful campaign, were so formidable that they could have fought, they could have reached Paris, and they could have crushed the revolution. But in sweetness and just a touching note about the Vendee, they were family men. They wanted to go back to their wives and to their children. They weren't soldiers. They didn't want to go to war. They were defending everything that they believed in. But after each campaign, when they were victorious, they would just go home and hope to be and pray to be left alone. Just an amusing sidebar note here that I think it was after the first battle of Cholet when the Vendeans lost they lost to begin with. They were being pushed back by the Blues, and so they retreated, as is natural, because they thought for sure they were all going to be wiped out in that one battle. And when they went over a bridge and got to the other side, their wives met them with frying pans and sticks and brooms and began smacking their husbands and say, "You get back on that battlefield and continue to fight." So the Vendean men turned around, went back, and won the day. I thought it was a beautiful, example of family cooperation against the devil. So it's important that when you study, and obviously I'm just touching on the Vendee uprising, but it's important when you study it to realize that some of the things that are said against them, the urban myths or the propaganda, is they started this war, that they were the aggressors. Nothing could be further from the truth. And if you want to read a very good source, a friend of mine, his name is Remnant. He has a book called The French Genocide, the Vendee, and he makes the point in there that in 1789, the people of the Vendee, quote, were not incited by their priests to riot and rebel. In fact, they recognized the need for reform in France because of some taxation. And that's another interesting connection. One of the reasons there were so many problems financially in France was because King Louis XVI had given weight, in my opinion, too much money to the American Revolution to try to help the Americans defeat his enemy, the English. And so that was one of the reasons. America was part of the reason that France was in the situation economically that it was at that moment. So the Vendeans, at first, in other words, went along with some ideas of reform, but they very quickly realized that they could not go along with the revolution's hatred of the Catholic Church, hatred of Christ the King. And because of their refusal to go along with the ideology of the revolution, they were denounced as enemies of the people. And very important to realize the irony here, that the great Enlightenment, the great defenders of freedom and liberty and equality and all of this up in Paris, that one of the first things they did was turn their guns, muskets, and cannons against their own people who disagreed with them. They turned against their own first, and what happened down in the Vendee must be considered the Enlightenment's first act of genocide. So these Catholics then in Western France, in the Vendee, because of their refusal to abandon the kingship of Christ in the Catholic Church, they were condemned as brigands who must be exterminated in quotes, from the order of the Republican government. Sachet quotes one of the revolutionaries as saying, quote, "We must crush the internal enemies of the Republic or perish along with it," end quote. So a call went out from Paris to, quote, "depopulate the Vendee." The Vendeans were spoken of as a race apart, and a call was made to, quote, "purge the soil of freedom of that cursed race in the Vendee." The revolutionary Toureau de la Lignée took command of what are to this day known in the Vendee as the 12 colonnes infernales, the 12 columns of hell, which had specific orders, both from his superiors as well as from himself, to kill everyone and everything in the Vendee. Even animals, livestock, had to be exterminated. Even if there should be some patriots, that is, Republicans in the Vendée, Thoreau said, they must not be spared. We can make no distinction. The entire province must be made a cemetery. And so it was in the streets of Cholet. By the end of 1793, wolves were the only thing left alive, roaming freely and feeding on the piles of decomposing corpses of Catholics.
死体の山を餌に食べ回っていたのです。
A reign of terror from north to south scorched the Catholic earth of France, while the Brotherhood of International Freemasonry, both in France and in the New World, stood by and applauded their lodge brothers' actions. And I'm going to skip some of this. We're running a little short on time. The brutality of the persecution is unbelievable down there. One of the things they did, they had something called the Republican marriages. Basically what they would do is they would throw a piece of floating wood into the river, and then they would tie a husband and a wife to that log, that circular piece of wood, so that when a husband or a wife wanted to take a breath, he would pull himself in the water on top to breathe, and put his wife under the water to die. And then they would stand on the banks of the river and laugh as the husband and wife slowly killed each other in the waters of the river. This was the mentality, the perverse, demonic, satanic mentality of the persecution. Secularist historian Anthony James Jones notes that in his book, Resisting Rebellion, The History of Politics and Counterinsurgency, he says, quote, "The suppression of the Vendée resulted in the total economic devastation of the region. Over 10,000 houses were burned down and 4/5 of the male population wiped out. The war reduced the permanent population of the Vendée by 1/3. More French died in the Vendée than in Napoleon's Russian campaign. Indeed, in relation to the total population of the time, the number of Frenchmen, soldiers, and civilians killed as a result of the French Revolution before the Napoleonic Wars had begun represents a far greater loss than France suffered during all of World War I."
アンソニー・ジェームズ・ジョーンズという人は
Freemasonry's vile hatred of the Bride of Christ had never been placed on display as it was in the Vendée. And we cannot have any meaningful discussion of the French Revolution without a word about the context of the French Revolution. And the context of the French Revolution is from top to bottom, beginning to end, inside and out, Freemasonic, the anti-Catholic fraternal order, which was condemned by 13 different popes from 1738 through 1978, because its ultimate aim was to de-Catholicize the entire world and to destroy the natural order of things as God created it. Pope Leo XIII called Freemasonry, in his encyclical Humanum Janus, he called it a foul plague. He said, quote, "The Freemasons' ultimate purpose forces itself into view, namely the utter overthrow of that whole religious and political order of the world, which Christian teaching had produced, and the substitution of a new state of things in accordance with their ideas, of which the foundation and laws shall be drawn from mere naturalism." End quote. And not only Catholic traditionalists, but leading secular scholars now recognize that Freemasonry was at the heart of the process of severing political society from its connection to the revealed religion. Thus, the universal campaign that we all see today to secularize the entire world.
私たちがこのフランス革命について、意味のある
The Enlightenment 230 years ago and the New World Order that we face today have the same exact objective: the elimination of the Bride of Christ from the face of the earth. And the Vendeans were the first responders. They were the first to notice, to know and understand what was happening. And they died defending the old order. I personally have been to the Vendée many times. If you want a good book to read in English anyway, it's Michael Davies' For Altar and Throne, The Rising in the Vendée, which I published. My flag, U.S. flag, always has the Sacré-Cœur emblazoned on it, just as the Vendéans emblazoned the Sacré-Cœur on the tricolor in France to show fidelity to the Sacred Heart first, no matter what country we're coming from. My office walls at home are lined with the images of the heroes of the Vendée: Monsieur Chalette, Monsieur Henri, Catalino, the Saint of the Anjou, Louis d'Albet. Why? Because they are our forefathers in the Catholic faith. They show us what we must do now. They faced everything we face and more because their lives were threatened literally, and yet they didn't falter. They stood as we must stand in defense of the old traditions of the Catholic Church, and specifically the kingship of Christ.
230年前の啓蒙主義
In 1993, in the Vendée Memorial of Les Lucs, when it opened its doors for the first time, Alexandra Solzhenitsyn was on hand for the opening of that museum, which might seem odd, a Russian in France to celebrate the Vendée uprising. It was attended by thousands of people, but of course the mainstream media ignored it. But at that time, Alexander Solzhenitsyn makes an interesting observation about the connection between the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. During his remarks, he said, quote, "We must live without lies, for otherwise we are not free. You gave us these dead as a legacy," the poet Pierre Emmanuel wrote. "We have become the fathers of our dead." Communist Georgia, we often had two portraits in government offices, side by side, Stalin and Robespierre, blood brothers, end quote. So says Solzhenitsyn.
1990
I'm going to skip a little ahead, Father. It's getting late, so you can go a couple of paragraphs. I want to just talk briefly about the connection, the way that what the Vendeans went through and what traditional Catholics went through. So when the central government of the French Revolution made the Catholic Church a state-run organization, they prosecuted priests who would not join the new church, for forbidding them to offer the Mass and the sacraments, which of course is the lifeblood of the Vendée. But I would point out that something very similar to happened to Catholics in Japan when the persecution began, to Catholics in my country after the Second Vatican Council, when they did something very similar to us. And I was there, I was a little boy, but I remember what it was like when they came in and destroyed our parish churches, when they threw out our pastor. I remember it very well. The priest who baptized me was thrown out of the church because he refused to abandon the traditional ways. They introduced a new Mass. They told us that we were forbidden to have our Mass. They took, in my case, the high altar of my church when I was a boy, hacked it up, and used pieces of it as parking lot blocks for cars to park on back in the early 1970s. My parents refused to go along with that revolution in the church. And this morning, when I attended the traditional Latin Mass of Father Onada, it was very similar, very familiar to me, because that's the way I grew up, way 6,000 miles from here in my hometown, when they took our churches and our priests and our Mass away from us. We had to have Masses in hotels in the same way as the Vendeans had done, as the Japanese Catholics must have had to do whenever they possibly could without their priests. So I'm trying to point out the consistency, how it's always the same, no matter where you are. You're expected to do the same thing, keep the faith, no matter what.
私の両親たちも同じような目に遭いました。
The heroes now are the heroes then, the heroes of the Vendée. One of them comes to mind, Jacques Catilino, the peddler, the saint of the Anjou, who denounced the revolution first. He armed himself with his rosary, his pistol and his saber and his badge of the Sacred Heart. And then he said to his men, quote, "Never forget that we are fighting for our holy religion. They attack us because they attack Christ. And when we follow Christ, when we make war on them, we defend Christ." And this quotation reminds me of a name I think that would be familiar to many of you, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who in a way reminds me of an awful lot of the spirit of the Vendée. They're all French and they have the same way. Archbishop Lefebvre put it this way, quote, he said, "The orders being given to us clearly express that they are being given us in order to oblige us to submit without reserve to the Second Vatican Council, to the post-conciliar reforms, and to the prescriptions of the Holy See. That is to say, to the orientations and acts which are undermining our faith and destroying the Church. It is impossible for us to do this. To collaborate in the destruction of the Church is to betray the Church and to betray our Lord Jesus Christ," end quote.
バンデの英雄たちは私たちの英雄です。
I can see we're desperately low on time, so I'm going to sum up with an example that I think typifies not only what the Vendée stands for, but also how it becomes an example for us. And that is just to point to one of the heroes of the Vendée, whose name was François Charette. He's a general who had fought in the American Revolution, who was not altogether, on the right page as far as Catholicism early on. He was no saint. He had concubines most likely. but that he gets dragged into service by the peasants. And then once he's engaged in this war in defense of altar and throne, he's transformed and he becomes a very saintly and very heroic man, and he dies a martyr's death.
最後に時間が来ましたので、フランスはシャレット。
And the reason I want to conclude with General Charette as an example is because I think in my country, and I don't know about here, but in my country, oftentimes the idea is that what we are fighting for is our religious freedom, the liberty to practice, to coexist with the other religions. And even some traditional Catholics sometimes, I think, mistakenly believe that is what our cause is all about. I would like to conclude with a formal rejection of that, because that's essentially what the revolution was all about from the beginning. It wasn't about a direct attack necessarily on the Catholic Church. It was the idea that all religions are the same, and what we want is a big brotherhood of man, and there's no religion that enjoys a special position, namely the one founded by Jesus Christ, the Catholic Church. So Charette is then offered, and that's why I think he's a great example for all of us to follow. After this brilliant campaign, where without hardly any men and very few resources, he's able to actually wage war against the French revolutionary troops. And finally, when he's been betrayed several times, broken treaties, General Hoche, the Republican general, offers Charette his religious freedom. He's so tired of fighting the king of the Vendee, he's willing to give him anything. So he says, you can continue to practice your Catholic faith, but the war must end. And General Charette, to his everlasting credit, said, I will not make a deal with the devil to save my skin. It's not about just having my religious liberty. It's about the rights of God, the rights in the proclamation of the kingship of Christ. And so he was arrested and he was executed. So to conclude on a positive note then, there's every reason to continue the fight. If you think about what happened in the Vendée, after they were wiped out for the most part, the earth was scorched and they were destroyed. What comes later in France? Names such as Saint Thérèse de Lisieux, names such as the Curé of Ars, the great Saint John Vianney. Some of the greatest saints in French history came after the Vendée. And that's because they literally gave their lives for the faith. And their example was so powerful that it changed history, because they let the revolution know they were willing to die for Christ. And the moment you do that, the revolution is disempowered. It has no power over you now. And they become fearful of you. They were afraid of the Vendeans. That's why they sent the infernal columns, to destroy that willingness to die for Christ. And they're afraid of us today. That's why they're enacting their laws with the European Union and the United States and probably here to try to silence us, intimidate us, shut us up. Why? Because the spark of the faith, if it burns just that much, can change history. That's the lesson of the Vendée. That's the lesson of the hidden Catholics of Japan. And we must make sure that's what we show history, that becomes our lesson, that people 100 years from now will have a conference and they'll be telling our story, that we kept the faith in the face of the mighty, evil New World Order, and we won our freedom. Freedom to say we are Catholics and we will always be Catholics, and to proclaim the kingship of Christ until the day we die. Long live Christ the King, and thank you so much for listening.